The persistent buzz of my phone in my pocket pulled me out of my concentration. Wiping away the sweat from my forehead, I stepped outside the temporary clinic. The midday sun cast long shadows over the rural village. When I saw the name on the screen, my stomach churned. Richard. I almost didn't answer, knowing from years of experience with my stepfather's antics that his calls rarely brought good news. Yet, curiosity, and perhaps a flicker of hope, got the better of me. "Hello," I answered, keeping my tone neutral. "Catherine," he greeted, his voice annoyingly cheerful. "Just thought you'd like to know I've sold the mountain cabin." I stopped in my tracks, clutching the phone more tightly. "You did what?" I asked. "Sold it," he repeated, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Don't act so surprised. It's for the greater good, mine. Obviously." He laughed smugly, fueling my anger. "My name is Catherine, and Richard has been a constant thorn in my side for as long as I can remember. My mother married him when I was 15, and he quickly ingratiated himself into the family with charm and humor. But his facade hid a man who never hesitated to put his needs first. The cabin was more than a vacation home. It was my sanctuary, a place I'd lovingly cared for over the years, nestled in the mountains, where I recharged after exhausting work trips, hosted friends for long weekends, and felt truly at peace. Hearing Richard speak of it as if it were just another pawn in his endless schemes was infuriating. "You had no right," I said, my voice trembling. "That cabin wasn't yours to sell." "Relax," he drawled lazily. "I've been managing things while you're off saving the world. Besides, why hold on to something when you're never around to enjoy it? It was an easy way to clear my debts. You'll thank me later." "I'll thank you when hell freezes over," I snapped, hanging up before he could say anything else. I paced back and forth, attempting to calm the turbulent emotions inside me. Richard's audacity knew no limits, but this time, he'd crossed a line. He was unaware, however, that the cabin wasn't solely mine to sell. My best friend, Laura, was a co-owner, and the legal agreement we'd set up years ago explicitly required both our signatures for any sale to be valid. This wasn't over. Sitting on the edge of my cot, I glared at the phone in my hand, imagining it might burst into flames. My mind raced, replaying Richard's smug tone repeatedly. How could he see this as acceptable, selling something so deeply personal to me like it was merely a trinket for his gain? The cabin wasn't just mine, it was my lifeline. It was where I'd spent summers as a kid, chasing fireflies and hiking with my mom before she remarried. After she passed, it became my anchor, the one thing that felt constant amidst the chaos. Richard, of course, held no such sentimental attachment. To him, it was merely another asset to exploit, much like many things he'd meddled with before. But this was not a minor inconvenience. This was my home. I tapped on Laura's name in my contacts and waited for her to answer. "Hey, Kathy, what's up?" she asked cheerfully when she picked up. "Richard sold a cabin," I blurted, unable to hide the anger in my voice. There was a long pause on her end. "He what?" "Apparently, he needed the money to pay off some gambling debts," I said bitterly. "He thinks he can do whatever he wants, but I know our co-ownership agreement makes that impossible. He doesn't have the authority to sell without your consent." Laura whistled softly. "He really thought he could get away with this. That man has no shame." "None," I agreed. "I'm going to need your help sorting this out. I'll wrap up my volunteer assignment and head back home as soon as I can. Can you pull up the legal documents in the meantime? I want to be ready to counter this when I return." "You've got it," Laura replied, her voice resolute. "We'll handle this together." As I hung up, a strange sense of calm settled over me. Richard thought he'd outsmarted me, assumed I was too far away to retaliate. But he didn't know whom he was dealing with. I wasn't the frightened teenager who allowed him to bulldoze over me. I was an adult now, armed with resources, allies, and a solid understanding of the law. If he thought this issue was concluded, he was in for a rude awakening. The following days went by in a blur as I finished my volunteer work, trying to keep my emotions in check. But no matter how busy I stayed, Richard's betrayal continued to linger in my mind, like an uninvited shadow. I couldn't shake off the vision of him gloating about clearing his debts at my expense. Late one evening, I settled down with my journal, an essential item I brought along on trips. Writing helped me unravel my emotions, and I was in dire need of clarity now more than ever. As I scribbled intensely, memories began to flood back. The first time I visited the cabin with my mom, the countless hours spent refurbishing it with Laura, the serene nights by the fireplace where time seemed to freeze. This wasn't merely a building, it was a part of me, and Richard thought he could just trade it away like a poker chip.
No, not this time.
Laura called me again the next day, her voice brisk and businesslike. I went through the co-ownership agreement, she stated. You were right. He didn't have the authority to sell it without my agreement. The sale is invalid. Relief surged through me, yet it swiftly turned to anger. Do we know who he sold it to? Not yet, Laura answered, but I checked the county records and there's no official transfer of ownership. It's as if he attempted to handle this underhandedly. That was precisely like Richard, always in search of shortcuts, forever trying to outwit the system. What's our next move? I asked. Well, we can either address him directly, Laura proposed, or we can let the legal process unfold. Either way, we're in a strong position. He has no legal grounds to stand on. I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Thanks, Laura. I'm not sure what I'd do without you. You'd figured out, she replied warmly, but I'll always have your back. As I ended the call, a plan began to crystallize in my thoughts. I'd wrap up my affairs here, return home, and confront Richard head-on. I wasn't going to scream or shout, which is what he expected.
No.
I'd take a different route. I'd employ the one thing Richard always undervalued, my foresight. He believed he had outmaneuvered me, but when it was all over, he would realize he had underestimated me for the last time. When I finally made it home, the first thing I sensed was the silence. The cabin always welcomed me with tranquility, but now the silence felt foreboding. My houseplants appeared slightly neglected, the mail was stacked by the door, and the fridge was nearly empty. I set down my bags, exhaling as the weight of my impending actions settled on my shoulders. Before I could start unpacking, my phone buzzed. It was Richard. I contemplated letting it divert to voicemail, but reconsidered. It was time to confront him. Well, if it isn't my globe-trotting stepdaughter. His voice oozed with insincere cheer. Finally back to reality, huh? What do you want, Richard? I got straight to the point. I just wanted to check in, he responded smugly. Make sure you're not too upset about the cabin situation. I mean, it's gone now, so no point crying over spilled milk. My jaw tightened. Funny you should say that, I replied evenly, because it's not gone. Laura, and I checked the ownership records, the sale didn't go through. You can't sell what isn't yours. There was a pause, a mere second that told me I'd hit a nerve. That's absurd, Richard retorted, his voice strained. The buyer paid cash and the paperwork is finalized. It's a done deal.
No.
And you expect me to pity you? You've made your choices, Richard, and now you'll have to live with them. The call ended with him abruptly hanging up, leaving me standing there, phone in hand, shaking with a blend of anger and triumph. For years, I'd allowed Richard to manipulate situations, guilt-trip me, and exploit my patience, but not anymore. I wasn't merely defending the cabin. I was reclaiming my boundaries, my voice, and my peace of mind. The following morning, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, reviewing the documents Laura had provided. The co-ownership agreement was crystal clear. Neither of us could sell the cabin without the other's written consent. Richard's actions weren't just unethical, they were blatantly illegal. My thoughts were interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. When I opened it, there he was, Richard, wearing with his usual self-assured grin. Richard asked if he could come in. I chuckled bitterly. Your luck? That's your plan, Richard? You've gambled money away for as long as I've known you, and there's never been a happy ending. Why would this time be any different? He squirmed in his seat, but his confidence quickly resurfaced. You're blowing things out of proportion. It's just a cabin. You're hardly here. Why not let someone else use it? Because it's mine. I snapped. It's my home. You don't get to determine what I value or how I use my property. And for your information, Laura values it as much as I do. Your little sale is void, and you know it. His face darkened, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of something akin to fear in his eyes. You wouldn't really report me, would you? You wouldn't ruin your own stepfather like that? I leaned forward, holding his gaze steadily. Try me. For the first time, Richard found himself without a quick comeback. He rose to his feet, muttering under his breath before storming out, slamming the door behind him. I sank back into my chair, my heart racing. The confrontation left me shaken, yet oddly satisfied. Richard was beginning to understand that his typical strategies wouldn't work on me anymore. This wasn't just about the cabin, it was about standing up to someone who had exploited me for too long. After Richard's dramatic exit, I called Laura to keep her updated. He turned up at my house, I said, pacing the living room. Tried to spin some sob story about how he borrowed the cabin to settle his debts. Laura chuckled on the other end. Borrowed? Does he even hear himself? What did you say? I told him the sale was invalid and that if he pushed me, I'd go to the authorities, I replied. That seemed to rattle him a bit, but knowing Richard, he's likely already plotting his next move. Let him scheme, Laura said assertively. We have the law on our side. I've contacted a lawyer to draft a formal cease and desist letter. If he tries to involve the buyer again, we'll have a legal paper trail ready to stop it. I nodded, her words grounding me. Thanks, Laura. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'd figure it out, she said, but we're in this together. Over the following days, I concentrated on gathering all the evidence I could. I collected the co-ownership agreement, saved screenshots of Richard's texts about the sale, and even tracked down the real estate agent involved. When I spoke to the agent, her tone was tense. I didn't know the whole story, she said quickly. Richard told me he had permission to sell. If I had known the cabin had a co-owner, I never would have gotten involved. Well, now you do, I replied evenly. I'm not trying to drag you into this, but I need your cooperation. Can you confirm Richard signed the paperwork alone? Yes, she admitted. The buyer hasn't paid in full yet because I flagged the transaction as unusual. I can provide you with the documents if you need them. That would be helpful, I said, jotting down her details. As I hung up, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Richard had counted on me being too passive or distant to fight back, but he was about to discover just how mistaken he'd been. That evening, Laura called with further good news. The letter's ready, she said. We'll send it first thing tomorrow, and if he tries anything else, we'll escalate. Perfect, I replied, a small smile creeping up my face. For the first time in weeks, I felt as though I was regaining control of the situation. Richard thought he could steamroll me, but he was about to find out that I wasn't as easily defeated. The following morning, Laura and I finalized the cease and desist letter and sent it to Richard. The language was clear and firm, refusing any further attempts to claim ownership of the cabin or engage with the buyer. I was ready to initiate legal proceedings. I imagined his reaction upon receiving it, likely a blend of anger and disbelief. For years, he had managed to manipulate and intimidate others into submission, but this time he faced an obstacle he couldn't charm his way out of. Later that day, the real estate agent sent me the promised documents. Seeing Richard's signature on the fraudulent sale agreement churned my stomach, yet also strengthened my resolve. He hadn't just overstepped a line, he had bulldozed over it. That evening, I got a call from Detective Miller, a local officer Laura had reached out to for assistance. "Ms. Daniel," he began in a professional tone, "I've reviewed the documents you and Ms. Langley provided. It's apparent the sale was unauthorized. With this evidence, we can proceed with a formal investigation if you wish." "Yes," I replied instantly. "I want to pursue this." Detective Miller continued, "We'll start by contacting the buyer to explain the situation. If Richard persists in interfering, we will escalate to criminal charges for fraudulent misrepresentation." "Thank you, Detective," I said. "Please let me know if you need anything else from me." Hanging up, I felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. The wheels were in motion, and there was no turning back now. The next day, Richard called, his voice tinged with anger and an undercurrent of desperation. "Do you realize what you've done, Catherine?" he demanded. "You're ruining everything."
Oh, Richard, iyan suarat calmly.
"I'm protecting what's mine. You brought this on yourself. You've always been so ungrateful," he sneered. "I stepped in when your mom couldn't handle things, and this is your gratitude?" I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. "You didn't step in, Richard. You took over. You manipulated, lied, and used people to get what you wanted, and now you're paying the price." He started to argue, but I interrupted him. "This conversation is over. If you have anything more to say, take it up with my lawyer." I hung up and leaned back in my chair, my heart racing. Richard's days of pushing me around were over, and I was finally taking control. 2 days later, Detective Miller called with an update. "MS. Daniel, we spoke with the buyer, and they agreed to halt the transaction. They were unaware of the co-ownership and are willing to cooperate with the investigation." Relief washed over me. "That's excellent news. Does this mean the sale is officially voided?" "Yes," he confirmed. "The cabin remains under your and Ms. Langley's ownership. However, we need to keep the case open to address your stepfather's fraudulent acts. Do you want to press charges?" I hesitated only momentarily. "Yes," I stated firmly. "I want him held accountable." "Understood," Detective Miller said. "We'll proceed accordingly. Thank you for your cooperation." After the call, I exhaled deeply. For the first time in weeks, peace returned. The cabin was safe, and Richard's schemes were unraveling. Later, I called Laura to share the news. "The sale is officially void," I told her. "The buyer's backing out, and the cabin is ours again." "That's a massive win," Laura exclaimed, excitement in her voice. "But what about Richard?" "The police are continuing their investigation," I assured her. "He's not getting away with this." "Good," she replied. "It's about time someone stood up to him." Her words stayed with me long after we hung up. For years, I allowed Richard to get away with so much, his manipulations, his entitlement, his complete disregard for boundaries, but this time, I fought back. It felt like a turning point, not only in this situation, but in how I approached everything in life. That evening, I visited the cabin for the first time since returning home. Stepping inside, I was overwhelmed with emotion. The smell of the wooden panels, the familiar creak of the floorboards, it all reminded me why this place meant so much to me. I sat by the fireplace, letting the quiet of the mountains wash over me. This was my haven, where I built memories, celebrated milestones, and found peace amidst life's chaos. And it remained mine, no thanks to Richard. For the first time, I let myself smile.